All right, so today we're going to talk about the different guidelines that we're recommending, or the different frameworks that can help us disrupt het cis norms. So we're going to start off today by talking about cultural humility. So cultural humility refers to a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby an individual not only learns about another's culture, but starts to examine their own beliefs and cultural identity. So it's kind of cool. Cultural humility is where we accept ourselves as humble learners. We recognize we're not going to know everything, so let's start asking questions and learn as much as we can, knowing we'll never reach 100% all knowing. So to be culturally humble, it means accepting we'll never know everything, like I just said, about another person's lived experience. But how we can change our framework is to view others as experts in their own lived experience. And we can learn from their expertise. So this is when we give others the space to be experts in themselves and not help, but like get to let them be experts and be empowered in getting to be experts in their own experience. And so as school psychologists, we then shift to our expertise and our skill set, and then learn how to incorporate the worldview of our collaborating partners, such as our LGBTQ youth and colleagues who may be impacted by het cis norms. So we can also, with cultural humility, be self-reflective, where we think about what's holding me back, what vulnerabilities do I have, and what strengths do I also have to help me be a change agent. So when we think about what it means to be culturally humble, there's two things we can do. We can learn from others and we can learn from ourselves. When we refer to learning from others, this refers to being culturally humble and accepting, knowing that we don't know other people's experience, and letting them be experts in themselves and us be experts in what we specialize in. As far as learning from ourselves, this is where we become self-reflective. Think about what has led to our own vulnerabilities and our own biases, so we can then take steps to challenge them and learn about our opportunities for growth. So to specifically learn from others and empower others as experts, we could first honor the expert's experience. So this is where we affirm and validate. We can say things like, "You're appreciated and deserving, just as you are." And we could also say, "Oh, that sounds really interesting," or "That sounds so important." So like when people share, we can then reflect how impactful that was for us. Second, we can ask questions. Instead of coming from a place of judgment, coming from a place of curiosity and interest in learning. So when we ask questions, we can say to someone, "Thank you so much for sharing that. I apologize if I'm imposing, and I'm grateful that you're giving me this opportunity to learn. Would you be willing to share more about this topic with me?" So you could say this to your grad students, or to people you're practicing with. "Could you tell me more about your experience of having a diverse sexual orientation in this school so I can learn how to best support?" The next one refers to expressing our gratitude. So when people take time, particularly from marginalized or discriminated against identities, we want to express our gratitude for taking time and space and energy to consume and listen to their stories. So we can say things like, "Thank you for your willingness to let me learn from you. This has been such an invaluable experience that will help me do better work and be a better person." So to start your culturally humble journey, you could think, what are some opportunities where I can learn from others? So if you can ask yourself that and take some steps after this video to then engage in some cultural humility, self-exploration, and question asking of others, that's steps in the right direction. So also when we self-reflect, it's helpful to ask questions such as, what holds me back from, feeling comfortable in spaces with people who have cultures different from my own? This can look like reflecting on our attitudes, our bias, or our held stereotypes. We can ask, how am I vulnerable? And that refers to, what are my fears if I ask questions or open up? Like, what happens when I show vulnerability? What will others think of me for asking this question? So when we ask questions, we're admitting that we don't know everything. So it's important that we reflect and plan our best for how we can be vulnerable and be okay with that in others' presence. Another question is, how will I self-care to ensure my ongoing engagement? Sometimes it can be hurtful or painful when somebody calls us out for something we've done that's wrong. But when people get called out, that's an opportunity to self-reflect and say, I'm sorry, let me learn from my mistake, and here's how I can commit to doing better. That intention to keep coming back to the table and doing what it takes to come back to the table is what's going to keep our culturally humble lens continuing, allowing it to continue thriving. So other questions we can ask are, what am I doing that's already making a difference? Because I'm sure as school psychologists, we're already doing things to help others. What can I do better at? So like making our own agenda of where we can improve. And what are actionable steps I can take toward doing better tomorrow that I can do better than I did today? So always committing to knowing that we can always be doing more within reason. All right, so now that you're reflecting on questions we can ask ourselves, the overarching question you can walk away with today is, where am I at with learning from and reflecting on myself? So in asking all these questions, setting off a little like agenda and a starting point and the places you can go so that you can be successful with your cultural humility self-reflection. Okay, so then we are in a different framework called the Aspire framework. Aspire is different from cultural humility. Aspire refers to adapting strategies to promote implementation, research, and equity. So Aspire is a 3-step process. The first step refers to us identifying harmful practice. So using Aspire, the goal is to identify the problem and then also identify what we can do to make change on that problem. So step 1, identify the harmful practice. Step 2, we don't just identify it, but then we recognize why it's harmful. We identify how practices perpetuate inequity and harm. And step 3 refers to our development of a strategy to implement aimed at reducing public health and health disparities. So let's look at what these look like. We're going to go into detail with step 1, identifying harmful practices. So when we think of how het/cis norms may be impacting our LGBT youth and others in our schools, we can know that the harmful practices of het/cis norms are happening at a systems and individual level. So at a systems level, this refers to things like policies, like, are we letting students use names they prefer or pronouns? Systemic messaging, are we saying you can only use a boy or a girl's bathroom, and anybody who doesn't use what we want you to use are going to get in trouble? School and university culture and climate policies, and school and university practices. So these are all systems level things. Then we can also identify harmful practices at an individual level. What am I doing? Am I only saying boys and girls come to the mat? Can I have all students come to the mat? See how inclusive that simple change was? So when we reflect on our attitudes, beliefs, our worldview, meaning like how we see things and make sense of things, our bias, our everyday actions we take just in interacting with people. When we identify harmful practices, it's going to be hard at first because we don't have any intent to do harm necessarily, but it's about that implicit bias that we were talking about earlier and that unconscious awareness that we need to take time, step back, reflect, and recognize what it is that we have to change. Okay, so here's an example of where we may see harmful practices that are happening in school psychology in terms of the het/cis norms across practice, training, and research. So across all of these domains, we know that problems, the harmful practices across all these, are when there are limited inclusive spaces in research settings, in training settings, in practice settings. So when there's limited inclusive spaces, such as bathrooms, locker rooms, inclusive policies, such as athletics, not having GSAs, gay straight alliances, or not having spaces where students with diverse sexual orientations and genders can be comfortable being themselves. Also, dead naming, not allowing students or researchers or practitioners to use their names that they're presenting, and instead going with the names on the record. So having these are problems across the board. In practice, examples of problems are assuming that students' caregivers are heterosexual or straight. So like if a student comes to the office and we say, oh, is your mom or dad going to pick you up? A student who has two moms may be really uncomfortable by that statement. So we could say, are your parents going to pick you up or your caregivers? Another problem is assuming that that people are heterosexual and cisgender in assessments and in consultations. So we want to limit our assumptions as much as possible. Also, in practice are having limited reflection on bullying policies and how inclusive they are of people who are not heterosexual or cisgender. In training, this looks like having limited time spent reviewing culture-specific competencies and humilities when working with LGBTQ students, staff, and colleagues. Also, having affirming frameworks enforced, but a limited exploration of what those affirming frameworks are. We want students to understand why it is we're having affirming frameworks and what the purpose is that's being served. Lastly, and also the problem with affirming frameworks is if they're helpful, and this is important, we want affirming frameworks, but if we don't refer to having them because of het cis norms, we're just being reactive and not addressing the actual problem that's fueling the need to be affirming. Then it's having limited reflection on program climates for LGBT students and colleagues. So if we don't actually take the time to intentionally create safe spaces, people are going to feel unsafe. They're not going to feel welcome. So these are things to be thinking about. And then in research, we see problems of conflating gender, sex, and corresponding sexual orientations. We don't have norms developed for people with diverse sexual orientations or genders. And also we overrepresent general populations that we assume are het and cis, but we aren't taking the time to parse out who the LGBT participants are, which can be problematic because there may be different norms and different experiences. And lastly, the idea of informed consent, where if we're recruiting participants and there are topics that youth cannot participate in because parents are limiting them because they're LGBTQ for some reason, this can be problematic. So we want to make sure that we have consent policies such as waived consent available to be able to support our students. But this right here is showing the step one, Aspire, identifying what's harmful. So this is right off the top of my head that we were able to generate as a team, but take some time to think beyond these examples, how het cis norms may be a problem or what harmful practices are happening that's perpetuating het cis norms. So now we're going to look at step 2 of Aspire, identifying how practices perpetuate inequity and harm. So in making sense of harm, we need to first understand privilege. So what is privilege? It's the idea of systemic power and the structural isms. Ableism, heterosexism, cisism, ageism, all of these areas where people can be discriminated against is in reference to privilege. So privilege empowers those who are heterosexual, who are cisgender, who are of a, in their 30s, 40s, and not, older or extremely younger. So having these isms creates a system of power and makes a space, empowers some people and disempowers others, making it more difficult to access power. So what we want to ask ourselves with privilege is, how do we benefit from things, or how are we perpetuating privilege as opposed to stopping it so access can be more equal among all people? We also, in understanding privilege, want to understand how het cis norms uphold privilege at the expense of others. So these are ways that we can really identify how practices perpetuate inequity and harm. All right, and so we're going to talk more about that. So as far as really understanding privilege even more, Privilege itself is an unearned access or advantage granted to specific groups of people because of their membership in a social group. Privilege can be based on a variety of social identities, such as race, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, ability status, sexuality, age, education level, and more. This is kind of the trail or the train or the domino effect of privilege. So when we have privilege, we build in structures such as bias to help perpetuate it. So the idea that certain people are likable and other people are not, or when we think of things like when we say that's so gay, even though gay is a label, saying that's so gay has a derogatory tone. And so it becomes problematic when we start to pair who people are with derogatory terms. So gay itself is not a derogatory term, but it can be said in a way that can not feel good. So we want to be mindful that that's one example of how we perpetuate bias. So then when we have bias, that then comes with power, empowering some and limiting power to others. It also disadvantages those, so limits resources. And what's important is that we are seldom aware of how our stereotypes and prejudices pass on. And this is what we call passive perpetuation. So even though we're not meaning to be mean, hurtful, or harmful, we actually are and need to be mindful of what it is that we're doing, which is why we use this Aspire framework. So it's important to note that it is possible to be marginalized and acknowledge one's privilege where there is privilege in a given context. So for instance, it looks very different to be a trainer with a diverse sexual orientation or gender, as opposed to a student in a program with a diverse sexual orientation or gender. So the reason why is because there's power in being a professor and lack of power in being a student, even though there are similar identities that may lead to discrimination, but there's still power in this position where there's not in this position. So these are just some things to think about. So then as we're also trying to understand the perpetuation of harm and why this is a thing, there's the acronym addressing that we can reference to think who has power and who's limited in it. So when we think of age, for example, where adults have power, children, adolescents, and elders do not. Thinking of oneself as developmentally able. So then we've got able-bodied people are in power, where persons with disabilities are out of power, have lesser power. Religion, we tend to think of Christianity as being like the empowered religion, where religions of Jews, Muslims, non-Christians tend to lack power. So these are some examples where age, developmental, acquired disability, religion, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, indigenous background, national origin, and gender. So we see all of these, how there is a culture of power and a culture of less power. So this is helpful in helping us think of who has power with privilege and who is disenfranchised. So now we were talking in the last phase of Aspire, just identifying what's harmful. So these are what we identified before, but this is the why. This is the step 2. So for instance, the idea of dead naming, pronoun use, and unaddressed microaggressions. The why here is that this spreads the idea that someone is not enough, or that they're wrong, that they're an other. If we're not able to use chosen names or pronouns, then there's the idea of being inferior because I'm not able to be who I am. Then this can lead to perceived isolation and lacking sense of belonging. Also, there's a sense of inferred rightness and wrongness that we see with being cis and het versus being having a diverse sexual orientation or gender. In practice, the idea, for example, of assuming a student's caregiver is heterosexual and straight, so saying, is your mom or dad going to pick you up? It might other students whose parents are two moms, like we said, it may make them feel like their family is wrong or different. And so this is a problem because we're assuming that we know students' family composition. In training, the idea of having limited time spent reviewing culture-specific competencies and humilities when working with LGBT students, staff, and colleagues. The problem, what makes this a problem and the why, is that we then encourage assumptions that school psych students have needed competencies when the values that they actually hold are disaffirming. So we're assuming that students have the skill sets when the assumption should be that students tend to have disaffirming values, or that people in general tend to be disaffirming of LGBT individuals until we train out of that harmful attitude. And then in research, and then what's also problematic is that when these go unchecked, this perpetuates passive harmful practice. So then in research, the idea of not having informed consent practices such as waived consent for LGBT students to participate with, we are valuing the assumption that LGBTQ youth can equally access research as their straight cisgender peers, when that's in fact not true. Parents may be inclined to withhold access to services and experiences from students, which is harmful and sad that students don't have access to things in the same way that they would if they were straight and cisgender. Okay, so now we're into step 3. We've learned with Aspire how we can self-reflect on what practices we're doing that are harmful, which we just do by questioning every behavior that we do in our work and asking, how may this be harmful, in step 2. So then step 3 is about developing and implementing strategies aimed at reducing disparities. So this is where we pose that intentional approach to push back against harmful norms and aims to instill helpful practices to facilitate equity and beneficence. Strategies should be simple and quick. They can be slow or complex to change. But we can, it is possible to have simple and quick actions, and it can occur at a systems level or an individual level. So things to think about as we identify strategies. A lot of people in trainings that I do talk about being scared of messing up, of making mistakes. And we're classically conditioned to fear making mistakes, meaning that we try to do things the right way, then we get yelled at for doing things wrong. And then that feeling wrong, like that unconditioned response, leads to an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response of, oh, that didn't feel good. I don't wanna try to do things the right way again because I just get yelled at. But we have to be okay. We don't have to be okay that people are yelling at us when we do things that are wrong, but we have to say to ourselves, I know I'm trying to do what's in the best interest of others and myself. And so I'm going to be okay, do what I need, self-care, and show up back at the table, because continuing to show up is the only way we're going to see change happen. So continue practicing, continue messing up, and be able to apologize and know that we can keep moving forward. We want to be guided by ethical principles of beneficence and nonmaleficence. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Beneficence being having an intent to do good, and nonmaleficence avoiding doing harm. More considerations are that we don't want to demand that people we are working with show proof of their inequality. We need to just accept that there are inequalities and that we are showing up trusting that we are here to do good and to repair these inequalities. We want to recognize that we want to that the shield of our privilege may blind us from injustices that are occurring. So it can be really hard for us to identify what practices are harmful if we haven't taken the time to really sit, self-reflect, and see. Because we're not bad people, but we may be doing bad things that don't even feel like bad things. We also don't want to offer up our relationship with a member of a marginalized group as evidence of my understanding. So I can't say, hey, I have a friend who's gay, so clearly I am allowed to help and be an expert in this. That's not accurate. We need to earn trust by building up trust, respect, and a relationship with the people that we are in the current moment with. And that happens just by like over shared laughs, smiling, apologizing, learning from each other over time. Lastly, over communicating and conveying what you know. People are not interested in what we know. People are interested in that we want to learn, and showing proof and evidence by recapping what we've been doing together to make sure that we're understanding and that we're going in the right direction to show that we're making that progress. So these are things to be aware of as we are working toward developing strategies. So how can we develop strategies? We can first have conversations, anonymous or identified, to learn what helpful strategies may be. Whether we're sitting with an LGBTQ student and asking, like, what are your ideas of ways that we can do better at X, Y, and Z? Even though that's imposing on time and space, if we reference back to that cultural humility bit of thanking and making sure that we're not soaking up more than we're able to give, these are good things to think about. What I've come to learn is that youth, if we're working to understand how to support LGBT youth, appreciate when they're not outed, but being consulted with as experts in their own lives and experience. And then when advocates and allies do the work with the knowledge learned from getting expertise from students. Also, it's helpful to learn what culture specificity looks like, because being LGBTQ, having a diverse sexual orientation or gender is not experienced the same way across every person. So we want to learn about the people that we are working with individually to really tailor and debunk what the harmful practices are and how they are experiencing it on an individual basis. So here's examples of strategies that can be used to address the harmful practices that we were talking about in step 1. So as far as dead naming, pronoun use, unaddressed microaggressions, cancel culture, what we can do, some strategies are committing to learn why it's important that we use chosen names and pronouns. And when legally allowed, use those chosen names and pronouns. When not, a strategy that I've explored and used is using the last names of individuals. So that way we're getting around using a gender specific name and using names that are condoned and legal in school. Also, trying our best, be comfortable apologizing and not giving up. Learn what is permissible so you can affirm proactively in your setting. In practice, the idea of assuming students, caregivers are heterosexual and straight in communication, we can just say parents instead of mom and dad, or caregivers. In training, the idea of having limited time spent reviewing culture-specific competencies and humilities and working with LGBTQ plus staff, students, and colleagues. What we can do is incorporate intentional lessons on competencies, ways to evaluate het/cis bias, and develop individual plans to grow in competency. We can also get trainees involved in developing inclusive bullying policies and advocacy. The more engaged, the more practice people will have in advocating to debunk het/cis norms. And in research, to address consent issues and difficulties in getting LGBTQ youth to participate in research, use things like waive consent, which are set up in place to help facilitate youth involvement. Okay, so that's it on Aspire. Now we're moving to a new framework of participatory culture responsive practice. What this refers to is participatory is where I, a researcher or a practitioner, work with the people in my environment. So let's say that I'm working with an LGBTQ student. We're going to both be experts. That's the participatory piece. The LGBTQ student is going to be an expert in their own lived experience, and I'm going to be an expert in my training as a school psychologist. So that's the participatory part where we combine and merge both of these expertise to value this combination of experts. And the culture responsiveness is really leaning into the expertise of the student we're working with or the people we're working with to make sure that their culture specific and responsiveness is what's being valued and incorporated. So I'm going to talk today about the participatory culture specific intervention model. This is a specific model that was developed by Dr. Nastasi, Dr. Vargas, and Dr. Moore, which looks at it's a 10-step process, sometimes an 11-step over 4 phases of how to work toward making a culture-specific plan or program or implementation strategy with culture-specific individuals. And we'll talk about how to apply this to, with het/cis norms today. So the idea that we typically see in schools is that there's a one-size-fits-all model. We do same reading interventions across students. We do the same math interventions. We have similar social emotional curriculum for students. But what PCSIM calls for is saying we can't have a one-size-fits-all model. We need to make things specific to students and colleagues that we're working with so that it resonates with them. I'm not going to have a kid who's who loves basketball have a social emotional intervention of painting a room a deep chartreuse color. That's not something that might be compliant with them or that brings them joy. Maybe I would instead create a sports related activity. So PCSIM is a systematic recursive approach that adapts empirical and evidence-based methods to meet a community's culture-specific needs. It includes procedures for engaging student partners in designing, implementing, and evaluating culture-specific programs. Why do we need PCSIM? Because we have existing programs that are meant to serve all students, and we have existing practices that we tend to lean into. But het-cis norms may be overlooked. We may be using programs that cater in their verbiage to males and females, that cater to romantic relationships that are heterosexual. So like if there's stories about how a boy has a crush on a girl, somebody else, a boy who has a crush on a boy might feel left out. And if we're looking at boys and girls, we're leaving out gender fluid and non-binary individuals. So we want to be mindful of how curriculums we're using may need to disrupt the het-cis norms that are in them. Existing models may have judgment, lack cultural competence, and don't account for how to defy het-cis norms. And we need to eliminate these power dynamics that we find in the practices and programs that we're using. So we need to engage in some problem identification through PCSIM. The goal of PCSIM is to demonstrate culture specificity through the development of program and practices to reflect shared language, belief, ideas, values, behavioral norms. So students and colleagues from specific cultures can recognize that this program resonates with me by partnering with them to guide generation of culture-specific, relevant, and responsive content and information. So this is the idea of traditional versus participatory of how programs are developed. In a traditional program, we see that we design a program, then we implement it, then we evaluate it. But in a participatory model, this is recursive. It goes back and forth until, like, if we find that there's a practice that doesn't resonate with a culture-specific community, or people with diverse genders and sexual orientations, or how het-cis norms can just be harmful to anyone, we may go back to the program design, even when we're in the evaluation process, to change content so that it better fits, because it would be harmful to continue with a program that's viewed as harmful. So you keep going back and forth to generate programs that are received as responsive, appropriate, and that defy het-cis norms. So these are the stages and phases of PCSIM. We don't have to go into detail on all of them, but just to give a general idea, we first begin with learning the culture and learning the literature. We then go into the formative phase where we learn like what goes into a culture specific model. And then we're going to develop, implement, and evaluate the model that we've developed. And then we're going to transition to translation and sustainability of when researchers or practitioners that are implementing a PCSIM approach leave so that the programming can stay. So what these phases look like is we first learn the theory, culture, research of what's going on. We work to build relationships. We're enmeshing ourselves in the literature to know what's already been done, what's been successful, what has been unsuccessful, who's written this. Is this by somebody that has the community's best interest at heart? So we're going to look into that and learn what that looks like. Then we learn the culture and form partnerships by not saying, I have an agenda that I want to carry out with this community. No, we instead take the time to just share some laughs, get to know each other so that we know that we genuinely do have best interests at mind and heart. And then we can work collaboratively together over trusting relationships. As we're then learning, like, what are het-cis norms and how are these impacting students and professionals in a community, we have goals and problem identification so we can debunk them. We then engage in the formative research to learn what's going to go into debunking these het-cis norms. And then we develop the actual theory that's going to be guiding our practice and intervention work. When we define and implement that culture-specific program, we then adapt it in live time because we may find that there's harmful practices. So that way we can ensure that we are getting practices that are responsive and aware of het-cis norms. We then implement and evaluate how that's going, and then we engage in capacity building and translation. So that way whatever's developed can sustain itself without the guidance and leadership of a researcher. So even though I talked about this as like a linear 10-step process, this arrow and these arrows show that this is all recursive and that we can go backward and forward as needed. We might want to evaluate and implement certain parts of programs so that way we can find out if this is, if this unit is helpful in the scheme of the entire program. So this is what PCSIM looks like. Lastly, I want to introduce ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. These are such great guiding principles as we're trying to debunk het/cis norms, because if we're guided by wanting to do good, which is beneficence, and wanting to limit the harm we do, non-maleficence, then we are going to be taking steps in the right direction, because we're not going to want the het/cis norms that we're letting persist. So that means that we are going to be actively committed to challenging the status quo that perpetuates these harms. And this we just do by putting an ethical hat on and reminding ourselves that we are here to do good work of beneficence and non-maleficence. So it's important that we also recognize that it's inaction that is also contributing to the problem. So in order to engage in beneficence and non-maleficence, we need to take action. We need to identify what barriers exist that are preventing us from doing right by students in schools and colleagues and faculty who are impacted by het/cis norms. So once we commit to taking action and to always being reflective, this also includes our commitment to beneficence and non-maleficence. So as we leave here today with all of these new learned principles that can guide our work in limiting het/cis norms and debunking them, we can ask ourselves, how have I practiced beneficence and non-maleficence in my schools? Where can I engage in these practices more? Well, that's it for today with this segment of PowerPoints, but thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you soon.